My name is Sacha Golob, and I'm the co-director of the Centre for Philosophy and Visual Arts, CPVA, at King's College London. Welcome to this instalment of CPVA Artist Interviews, and I'm delighted today to be talking to the live and performance artist Noemi Lakmaier about her practice and her recent work. Noemi's been exhibited very widely, both nationally and internationally, including at the Wolverhampton Art Gallery, at the Whitechapel Gallery, at Acebex Gallery, at the Lab in Dublin. Her recent performances have taken place at locations including Tate, the Sydney Opera House, and as part of the Cultural Olympiad. I began by asking her about some of the aesthetic choices in her work and their relationship to themes of desire and happiness. Noemi, thank you so much for joining us here today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to just start by asking you a little about what you might call the style of your practice. So one of the things that's immediately striking visually is that you have some works where there's this kind of palpable air of menace. So there's sort of surveillance, there are bars, there are these kind of tropes of a kind of impersonal, unaccountable power. And then there's another aspect of the practice that has a sort of almost a kind of surreal or humorous sensibility to it. I guess a levity. I mean, that's a word that I think is very interesting in relation to some of your other work I'll come back to. But I guess just how you see the connection between, I suppose, the menace strand and the surreal or humorous strand.
I know what you mean by them sort of manifesting one aspect more in some works and one aspect more in the other. But I think what I'm aiming for with most of my work is there to be a clash of the two. Right. They kind of meeting on an edge of the absurd. To bring this very menacing, controlling, restrictive into the everyday and the jokey and the banal. So I think, for instance, in Caraphobia, that's very visible for me, at least, to contrast this lovely, bubbly, cheerful, dreamlike image of these 20,000 balloons in contrast of the heaviness and the restraint of my bound body pulling downwards and the discomfort of that. And I guess to some extent that's my aim with almost all my work, to meet and to kind of clash those two stylistic elements.
So, I mean, I suppose perhaps if we talk a little about Caraphobia then. So this is a work in which your body is held aloft, immobilized by the bounds with this huge number of balloons.
Yes.
Right? And I mean, it's interesting there. So, I mean, at points in your practice, the balloon, I mean, so there's clearly a relationship there between, so Caraphobia is the fear of happiness, right? Yes. So I suppose one way to read that is the balloons are happiness or wishes or desires or dreams or something like that. But that rather than bringing joy or bringing pleasure, they're in some sense a source of immobilization or a source of confinement.
I think they're questioning that.
Right.
I think my work is a lot more questions than it is statements.
That's a good way to put it. I suppose this word levity that I used before, so something that struck me with the Caraphobia case is people who have that worry, who worry about, being trapped by desire. Like Schopenhauer always talk about being on a treadmill of desire, and your desire is controlling you, and your desire is kind of, in a sense, both puppeteering you and rendering you immobile. Those people often talk about the weight of desire. Yeah. But I thought it was interesting that here, of course, desire is figured through lightness.
The levity of desire.
Exactly, it's levity. And maybe you could say a bit about that notion of levity.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me there's also that sense of that in the beginning that levity is seen as such a positive, dreamlike thing, but actually the levity itself is what is the most menacing about the piece, because it is what is physically threatening. And in a way, it's the only thing that is physically threatening about the piece, which is the same that most people initially, I get this reaction of, oh, hasn't everybody dreamt of floating by balloons? And it's like, well, I hope you haven't, because it's actually quite a dangerous endeavor to undertake. And I think that's a question that I'm asking, is your desire actually really quite menacing in and of itself?
No, absolutely. And I mean, there's of course something quite impersonal about how the balloons there, how the desires are figured in relation to the person. They're exterior to you. They're obviously not under your control. I mean, is that the line of questioning, or one of the lines of questioning you want to have in there?
It is. I think not being in control, it manifests itself especially in Caraphobia, but it it is a really important element of all my works that, and I think there's a power play in the play with control, that ultimately, of course, I'm in control. I'm the one designing, so to say, the works and coming up with the concepts and the ideas, but then there comes a point when I hand over the physical power and the control over my body and my safety to others.
Yeah. And that's interesting because you see that both, I guess, across these stylistic registers. So I'm in a work like Undress Redress, where the register is much more on the sort of menace end of the scale, and you're being physically moved about by this kind of unaccountable figure, or what seems to the audience at least a kind of unaccountable figure. I mean, could I just ask you, I mean, one other thing relating to Caraphobia, is the role particularly of balloons in the practice? Because, so that's something you come back to a lot. There's some pieces like 3442, where the balloons are very much used to exist on this boundary between the menacing and the surreal. So this is a case where you're wearing, in a way, kind of riot gear, riot police gear.
It is a genuine decommissioned British police riot helmet, yes.
But then you're blowing up the balloon. So, I mean, what is it about balloons specifically? Why?
I really enjoy their simplicity.
Right.
And I enjoy their obvious symbolism of party and joy.
Right.
And I love the fact that there are a lot of people who are phobic of balloons. I love the fact that something that is so light and fun and also cheap, I like their availability, can become something that becomes so immediately threatening.
Yeah.
While not being threatening. I think a balloon kind of sits on the boundary of the fun and the threatening. I really enjoy that about them.
And I guess there's just a nice associative kind of semantic range with them. Like when I was looking at Caraphobia, I was thinking of phrases like, bursting with happiness. So the balloons are inherently a very fragile thing, like, I guess in some sense, like aspirations towards happiness. But then also, as you say, they exist on this slightly uncanny place between the threatening and the...
And I also really enjoy the fact that they're a vessel of containment, but a flexible vessel of containment, and that, in a sense, in their joyful mode, they contain an aspect of the world, and in their threateningness, they release that.
Yeah. Next, we turn to the role of third parties as a tool in her performance practice. So the next aspect of your work I'd like to ask you about is a feature of your performance practice, which I found very interesting, which is the use of kind of a third party to intervene between the artist and the audience. So one case that has this is the first version of We Are For You Because We're Against Them. I'm thinking here of the group who are having the meal. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that piece.
Dinner party guests.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about the piece.
Well, its original manifestation was a dinner party for 8 guests in Dublin, and they were just ordinary members of the public who participated, and at the promise of a 5-course meal. And really that was, in a very simple way, what it was. It was 8 guests invited to have a 5-course meal with silver service, waiting, and under the conditions that they were going to sit in weebles. And weebles are these, they used to be these 70s, 80s toys. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. And I made these 8 human-sized weebles, 80 centimeters in diameter, and invited these 8 volunteers to participate in a dinner party. And the way the setup was is that the whole gallery was taken up just by the diners in their weebles, and audiences could, and of course the waiters and the food. And the audiences could only watch from a gallery above or from outside in the street. And that was very deliberate to set up this voyeuristic scenario of watching something and creating this scene, I think, where a lot of audience members were sort of sitting on an edge if they're watching something funny that they were allowed to laugh at, or if there was actually a sense of discomfort and wanting to look away from these people who looked, of course, ridiculous, but were also struggling to consume all this beautiful food. Yeah,
because presumably they can't control any of their movements.
It's quite tricky. It's messy. So you were asking about the intermediary of the... in that piece particularly, for me, they just became objects among objects, but autonomously acting objects. They very much became part of the artwork. I think they part of the performance in the sense I think in that piece I don't see them as performers, I see them as additions to the objects.
Right. And their role vis-a-vis the audience is to introduce this voyeuristic dimension, but in a sort of unsettling or destabilizing way. Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Right.
Whether I achieve that, you'd have to ask the audience members.
No, I mean, I've obviously only seen it on video, but I mean, it's an extraordinary. The Weebles are extraordinary things, and I'll talk a bit more about them later on when we get onto kind of notions of objectivity. I mean, another example that interests me is on the same kind of lines is, so this work, You Are Welcome. So here the artist is in a sort of almost a literally welcoming relationship to the audience. So they kind of enter on your clothes.
They enter on my clothes, yeah. Unknowingly.
Yeah, exactly. And then something that's interesting about it is that one of these kind of sort of faceless power figures at some point removes the artist, but you don't know when that's going to happen, if that's right. And I imagine the audience are kind of unsure as to what the relationship between you and this figure is. So again, you've got this kind of third-party effect.
And he really peels out of the audiences, and he was mingling in the audience, and I think nobody else would have known who he is until he came, stood next to me, and picked me up.
Right.
Picked me. I don't know if that's even the right way to say.
And what's
picked the artist's body up.
And what's the? Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, that's really interesting. And this notion of the sort of how easily the body can be moved. I mean, there were you. Is that? Do you see that in the same kind of voyeuristic, forcing the audience to become voyeurs and to question what they're doing there, or is that playing a different role?
No, I think there is a similar element to this, and this sense of discomfort and forcing people into situations of discomfort without giving them a choice, in some ways. When they were walking in on my dress, they had no way of knowing that they were walking in on my dress, and I was very curious about how far people would go. Yeah. And their responses when they finally decided to step off the dress or not. Yeah. But I was putting my perceiving body out of the position of actually being able to observe this because I had a paper bag over my head.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, sorry, I was just thinking about, this issue of creating a discomfort or creating a choice or creating an unsettlement in the audience. There's this lovely phrase from Auden's Memoriam for Freud, where he talks about techniques of unsettlement, kind of ways of sort of putting the audience off balance. And another interesting case is your One Morning in May. So, again, if you could perhaps just tell us a little about how you saw that work.
Yeah, and One Morning in May is the piece where I crawled from Toynbee Hall in Tower Hamlets to the Gherkin in the city. Yeah. And the way that one came about is that I was spending a lot of time at arts admin at Toynbee Studios, and I became so aware of how small the distance is geographically between Tower Hamlets, which at the time was one of the most deprived areas, or the most deprived area in Europe, statistically, and the city being the most affluent, wealthiest area in Europe, and it's a mile between the two. That ordinarily can be walked in, I guess, 10, 15 minutes, and I think we missed that. We missed this enormous socioeconomic bridge that we're crossing in a kind of casual stroll. So my crawling from Tower Hamlets to the city was very much a sort of physical attempt at mapping this socioeconomic divide, doing it over 7 hours on my hands and knees rather than in 10 minutes.
And as you're doing this, obviously so you start out wearing this very smart suit, and of course, very rapidly, this is, being shredded, and, there's clearly an immense act of physical exertion. And it's interesting when you see the footage of people's reactions to it. Did people try to intervene at all, or do people? Very, very few.
I was offered water once.
Right.
And I think I heard from a distance somebody shout, "Why doesn't anybody help her?"
Right.
There's very, very little interaction. There was one quite early on, but it wasn't helpful at all. But this guy walked next to me, and then sort of touched my back and shouted at me, "Lick the floor, bitch."
Wow.
That was the most physical interaction we had.
Wow.
But yeah, it was really surprising.
Right.
And even, I mean, I got nervous at sort of halfway through because we were very close to police officers,
right.
and we'd made a deliberate decision not to inform the police because
right.
that could have led to, becoming unnecessarily complicated, I guess.
Yeah.
But when I was crawling past so closely to police officers, I was extremely nervous that they'd stop it or intervene. They didn't.
Wow, that's extraordinary. And I mean, do you think? I mean, I suppose one possible explanation for the lack of interventions from the public at large is because they understood this was a kind of performance. So do you think that was
possible.
the case, or do you think?
I think that is possible.
Right.
I mean, cameras. There was visible relief from people's faces once they saw the camera.
Right.
We did try to be very discreet with the camera, so it was all shot with from a long distance with a zoom lens. But of course, it's unavoidable to have it visible in some way. So I think that's an element of it. I think also London is a city where you can stand on your head and die of a heart attack and nobody would look twice.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But that became very much a part of the piece, I think, this unpredictable interaction.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's interesting as well as you go on and you become, inevitably the kind of outfit becomes progressively more damaged, and of course people are less likely to help someone who seems to be wearing...
Pretty disgusting.
Well, or someone who seems to be wearing clothes that look damaged. I mean, so there's all this kind of extraordinary unwillingness to help people who look like they most need help. We then discussed the conception of objects and of the body that figured in Noemi's work. So the next issue I was hoping we could talk a bit about is the idea of objectification in your work, or of being an object. Mm-hmm. So I suppose one facet of this is sort of classic ideas of objectification along gender lines linked to these themes of voyeurism that we've discussed. Another aspect, though, is some notion of the object, of the body as an object, or of the loss of fluid control over one's own body. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking here of something like exercise and losing control, where you're in one of these Weeble things. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could say a bit about that and how you see it.
About exercise and losing control?
Yeah, and I guess, and if this idea of the loss of smooth control rings true to you as a description, I mean, am I just seeing that, or is
I think that's a really good way of describing it. I think with exercise and losing control, there is an element to it that it was my first performance object. So
oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that.
The first one I ever made.
Right.
Fresh out of university.
Right, I didn't know that.
So I think it was a little bit haphazard, without much thought in beforehand. But yes, at the time, my thinking around that was that I am a total control freak.
Right.
And that I wanted to create something that very deliberately took that control away from me.
Right.
But I think the thinking around that and becoming an object and the body as object was actually something that grew out of that piece rather than something that informed that piece up front.
Oh, okay, interesting. Okay.
So I think from then on in, I was sort of aiming to more and more become an object, for my body to become an object, and for me, for the duration of a performance, stop being me and become object, in a sense, like an object like other objects in the piece, which is, of course, a completely impossible task.
Yeah.
And I think the more my practice has progressed, the more it really becomes about that play of impossibility, that attempt to achieve something that isn't possible. And really, by the more I attempt for my body to become object, the more it inevitably has to extend out into the world and become more body, because its physical dependence increases rather than decreases.
Right.
Say when I'm strung up 6 feet above the ground under a bunch of balloons, yes, the aim is to become an object and wait for the balloons, but of course my physical dependency is way larger than when I'm just me. Right. So rather than retreating into my own objecthood, I extend my physicality into the space.
Right, that's brilliant. And so there's this, on the one hand, you've got this access of loss of fluid control. On the other hand, you've got the boundaries of the body, the boundaries of the self extending out into the world, and how those two things interact. I mean, another work that I found interesting in this regard is Experiment in Happiness, where your body is kind of almost an adjunct stuck on the side of this vast kind of globe of shoes. I mean,
kind of like the globe of shoes has grown a cancer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you're a growth on this object, right? And I mean, I suppose that then links back to these other themes, or at least, I mean, it seemed, that's how I was reading it, of, I guess, of destabilizing, but also of creating some kind of opportunity for empathy or understanding. I mean, with the shoes, you've got, I guess, phrases like walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I mean, a kind of notion of empathy. And on the other hand, it's very destabilizing if you actually try and wear someone else's shoes. It's very hard to stand up. So.
And of course, if somebody tried on another pair of shoes, they would have destabilized me.
Right. Yeah, exactly, because the globe would tilt. Mm-hmm. Right, okay, brilliant. And I mean, again, we see this kind of gamut of styles, right? So sometimes, I mean, undress, redress, the body as object is done in this very menacing context, or at least it looks that way. But then you have another piece, Zero, where you're carried around by...
Much more humorous.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost like, I mean, I hesitate to use the phrase, but it seems almost like a kind of, at least, obviously I didn't say it like, but in still footage, it seems almost like a kind of fun run or something. I mean, how do you see the relationship between these two styles in this case?
Oh, God, the relationship between the two. I mean, I think just in a very simple way, I think Zero was a lot more humorous. Its intention was to be a lot more humorous. And it was part of this cultural Olympiad event at Much Venlock, the birthplace of the modern Olympics. And there was a bunch of performance artists who just started doing all this crazy stuff in this sleepy little town. And it was intended to be sports related, but kind of parodying sports. And that's where the idea comes from, to become a human baton. Right. And to have these two guys in suits carrying me. And I think some of what doesn't come through in the photographs is just the kind of hilarious banter behind it. These two guys who were recruited to be people who said, oh, I'm strong, I can carry a human baton. And sort of beforehand, they were sort of egging each other on, like who's the bigger man and who's going to... Because they were running a relay around the town carrying me. And I think to everybody but them, it was pretty obvious right from... I mean, they were lovely, sorry, I kind of want to put that out there. But that they would get very tired very quickly. There was part of it became this sort of proving that they weren't getting tired, and this sort of sense of embarrassment and shame that their manlyhood didn't quite live up to what they had promised. And of course, the same thing became true, that by me becoming object, I became more human because a baton they could have dropped.
No, that's brilliant.
And in their getting tired, their awareness, I think, of me being a human being that they shouldn't drop increased.
And I suppose also it goes back to these issues of weight and levity.
Weight and levity. I think responsibility comes into that too, and I think with a lot of my work that I'm very deliberately passing responsibility for the body I have to other people. Right, yeah. And that is something that I'm playing with in a lot of my work.
Yeah. I mean, and I suppose that sets up then these dynamics of trust or control, or trust and control. To pass the responsibility over to them as an act of trust, it's also in a sense of loss of control. That they now carry you. They're now, you're no longer controlling where you're going. You're no longer controlling where you end up. Next, we discussed the influence of the philosopher Martin Heidegger on Noemi's practice and thought. You've been working recently on a philosopher who I've always been very interested in, Martin Heidegger, who's obviously a sort of profound and profoundly problematic figure. I mean, I think particularly, in the last kind of 10 years when we have access to the diaries from the war period, and it's no longer really possible to kind of whitewash his commitments in the way that perhaps it was before. But he nevertheless remains a philosopher of kind of, in some ways, unique power. And I was wondering if you could just start by saying a bit about what you found interesting in him, or why
That's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, why what drew you to think about Heidegger? Why were you doing that?
I mean, I guess what initially drew me to reading Heidegger is training as an existential therapist. And
Right.
The entire first term is only being and time.
Wow.
It's the only
Okay.
thing that is covered in the first term.
Okay, wow.
And it is compulsory reading. So
Okay.
That's what forced me into Heidegger. And it's a very odd experience to be so swamped for 10 weeks with nothing but being and time and talking about Heidegger.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So that is what drew me in, and yeah, I think flooded me and has seeped into my practice. And I think, as you're saying, it's so problematic that I think for me he's the philosopher who most accurately and fascinatingly talks about what it means to be human.
Right, right.
And how can somebody who's capable of writing like this and clearly, presumably thinking like this, if he's able to write like this, at the same time, I've been a committed member of the Nazi Party. It makes no sense to me.
Right, right.
There is such a discrepancy in those two.
Right.
That I almost find I have to compartmentalize this and enjoy and work with his philosophy and,
Right.
and ignore his politics, but that sounds awful just saying that.
Right, right.
So I think I'm very much still in a struggle with this.
Right.
I mean, one of my professors says he's comfortable with that. He can just take the philosophy and ignore the rest. I'm not so sure I can do that, but I feel very much in the middle of that and working that out for myself.
Right. And I know recently you've been responding to a particular work, The Thing, which I guess is from the middle period, and it contains this kind of focus on what are in some sense everyday objects, and in some sense objects that kind of transcend the everyday. So he's talking particularly about the jug. I was wondering if you could say a bit about how do you, your response to that piece of writing, what you found there, what seemed powerful to you there?
I mean, I think what you've just said is summing it up really well, because I think it speaks so well to a lot of my practice and the objects that I use, that the way he talks about the jug, this very everyday thing that also transcends. And I think for me that's objects, the kind of objects that I look to work with. And we were talking about balloons earlier. I think there is so much of a parallel between Heidegger's jug and the balloons.
Right, right.
I mean, I think there's a way that you could, in a Heideggerian way, speak about a popping balloon.
Okay. Tell me. That sounds so cool. So, what kind of and what connection do you see there?
Well, I think this. I mean, maybe this is I'm looking at this too simplistically, but you know how he's talking about what the jug can contain and and what it doesn't, and I mean, I kind of think of this, the jug and the balloon containing some of the world and releasing the world in its either falling over, breaking, or bursting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking because in one of the videos of your performance of this, so you're sitting outside and you have a jug on a table. You're sitting outside Tate, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And you gradually knock it to the floor. And I suppose the process of destruction there is interesting, because I mean, jugs, in a sense, when they're broken, they look as if you should be able to repair them. You know, you can see all the pieces, and there's this kind of great temptation that you can stick everything back together and it'll all be okay again. But of course, you can never stick everything back together.
Nothing can ever move backwards.
But it's interesting because there's a kind of different structure of breakage there from the balloon. You know, in the balloon, it's a sudden moment of bursting.
Yeah. I think that's true. There's a big difference between the balloon and the jug in that case.
And I mean, when you push the jug off the edge, I mean, could you say a bit about how you saw that part of the performance, or how you saw that act?
I think on the one hand there was this Sisyphean task of going through a huge amount of effort of repairing it to then just break it again.
Yeah.
But I think there is also an element of that you touched on, of this impossibility to go backward and trying to attempt something impossible.
Yeah.
I guess there is some parallel to becoming an object as a body, to try and attempt something that isn't actually possible.
Yeah.
And I suppose when we're talking about Heidegger, and I'm more or less thinking out loud as I'm saying this, but isn't there something about that the falling of the jug is part of the jug's sort of thrownness in the world, and you can't go back from that. So I'm kind of attempting for the jug to be in the world in a way that's not really possible.
Yeah. And is it, no, I mean, it's thrownness in every sense.
It's literally thrownness in every sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I suppose, again, just this stylistic issue that I think the bits of, in Heidegger, for me, the style and the politics often seem quite closely interlinked. You have at times, I mean, it's obviously, incredibly rich, but at times there's this kind of sort of deeply conservative stylistic palette, and that links to a kind of Blut and Boden politics. Whereas obviously the balloon is from a very different stylistic register, and so it's interesting kind of taking some of these Heideggerian tropes, but putting them in from what his perspective is going to be, the wrong colours, the wrong material. It's it's plastic, it's technological.
He would have hated plastic.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just a completely different aesthetic, but can nevertheless carry some of these ideas across still. And also challenge them and change them in some way. One last thing. I was, at the end of the video, at the end of that performance, do you say, so I think as you exit the screen, you say, "I'm very sorry."
Do I?
Yeah. Is that intentional to it, or is that?
I have never watched a video all the way to the end.
Okay.
Oh my God, I have to watch it when I get home.
Okay, well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, because I was just wondering if that was intended as part of,
Well, I think now that it is out there, it has to be intended.
Okay, really? Okay, so we've expanded the work. That's not too bad. I mean, we've been talking about these themes of different senses of the body as object, the body as subject in some way, and where that boundary lies. I mean, Heidegger sometimes draws a distinction that you see in lots of phenomenology, I guess, between Körper and Leib, between, I guess, different notions of what you might call the lived body or the object body.
The body I am and the body I have.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, how do you see that kind of, I mean, is that helpful in articulating your practice, or?
I think it is. I think it's something that I'm in the process of thinking through, but I think there is something very pertinent in thinking about when I am in this position of becoming object, what concept of the body is becoming object? Because for me, at the moment in talking about this, it feels like almost I'm presenting the body I have within the work as object, while the body I am is almost taking a back seat.
Yeah.
But saying that, I'm also very aware that separating the two out in such a neat way is making the philosophy a bit too simplistic, because I think they do. But that's how it feels to me thinking about it now. That sort of the body I am is leaving.
Yeah.
To take the role of a director on the outside.
Yeah.
And leaving the body I am behind.
Yeah.
To be
the body
dealt
I have.
with. The body I have.
Yeah.
To be dealt with and done to.
Yeah. I mean, are you interested in Merleau-Ponty at all as a kind of counterpoint to this?
Yeah, I am.
Because I mean, that's always, I mean, in some ways that's one of the bits I find problematic about Heidegger, is that there's an occlusion of the body because there's an occlusion of the animal. So there isn't sufficient discussion of the way in which we are sacks of stuff pumping things from one sack to another. I mean, is that kind of sense of, I guess, a grossly material body? I mean, I suppose as in some ways you could align with the body I have. I mean, does that ring true from your kind of perspective?
I think so. I mean, I think talking about Merleau-Ponty, I think talking about my work in the context of like Flesh of the World and stuff, I think that could make a lot of sense.
We concluded by discussing Noemi's practice as an existential therapist and the influence that has had upon her art. So I'd like to end, if I could, by just coming back to something you mentioned earlier, which is obviously fascinating. So you've been training, or you've trained as an existential therapist, right? And you mentioned that in some ways this was working through into your practice. I mean, I wonder if you could just, and that's really such a fascinating area, if you could just say a bit about how you came to do it, or how that working through manifests itself, or
how I came to be an existential therapist. Well, I mean, I started on an integrative master's.
Right.
And it very quickly became clear to me that the existential route was in a way the only one that made sense for me.
Right.
It's interesting, we talked about objectifying bodies earlier, and I think the reason why really only existential therapy was an option for me is because I think, sorry, all therapists out there who disagree, but that almost all other directions of therapy objectify the client and to some extent the therapist, to reduce people to, there'll be different language and different modalities, but to diagnosis, to neurosis, to whatever, to...
Right.
And existential therapy doesn't do that, but come from a philosophical background and looks of problems with living. And it is in essence very Heideggerian. I mean, we look at other philosophers too, but it looks at being in the world and the problems that may arise within that for all of us.
Right.
And the way I see it, at least, is there's no hierarchy in existential therapy. I mean, I guess in a practical world, there's always a hierarchy because one person hands over money to another person and talks to them. But it is reducing, I think, that hierarchical dynamic as much as possible and just make therapy into a conversation between two human beings.
Right.
And that feels, for me, the only way to conduct therapy ethically.
Right. That's fascinating. And in terms of the impact on your practice, is there an example you could give or something that comes to mind in particular, or has it been a more sort of general?
I think on the moment it still feels very general because it is relatively new. I mean, for now, what's really influenced this is the philosophy that it has really entrenched me in the training. Because it is, I mean, the 2 years that were now specific about training in existential therapy, the vast majority of the reading is philosophy and not therapy related. And there has been so much of that reading that has then sparked off into my practice, as we were just seeing earlier, and changed the thinking about who I am and where I'm at in my practice.
And I mean, do you see the arts practice as a continuous activity then with the therapy? I mean,
for sure.
But I mean, also for the audience, say, I mean, do you think of the audience as, the audience who are on the receiving end of the arts practice, so to speak, are in some way in the same position as people who would be on the receiving end of the therapeutic practice, or?
I think that is ethically a very difficult question to answer.
Right.
Because you have a very specific commitment and relationship with a with a client, which I think could not be upheld in the same way with an audience.
Right.
And as I was saying earlier, I think I am coercive with my audiences at times. Which is something I would hate to think that I am with my clients.
Right.
Wow, that's a tough one too. Because in some ways I would like to say yes, I would like to have a similar relationship. I think there could be a drifting in and out. So I find myself at the moment gravitating towards, there's nothing out there yet as such, but towards more one-to-one performances.
Right.
And I think there could be a greater similarity to a therapeutic interaction.
Right.
Although, of course, then this other performer becomes one of these bodies that becomes an intermediary between the work and the world. I think in the way it manifests itself, it might be very similar to therapy, but if it is ethically the same, I'm not so sure.
Right. That's fascinating. I mean, I suppose there are also presumably all kinds of issues as to whether you exercise any choice over who your audience is in relation to choosing. I don't know how you would refer to them, participants in the therapy. I mean, do you select the participants?
Do you mean my clients?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, unsure what. I mean, would you, in this context, would you think of them as patients or are they?
Clients.
Right.
I think usually. I like the participants. That's That's a nice term. Do I choose them? I mean, normally they choose me.
Right.
Theoretically, I could reject them. I haven't done that yet.
Right.
But I would leave that option open in case there is. I don't think I could name a specific example, but I can imagine that at some point I find myself opposite somebody where I feel I can't work with this person.
Right.
Or I just can't be with this person, and that wouldn't then just be not not pleasant for me, it wouldn't really be fair to them.
Yeah, it wouldn't be productive. No, and I suppose the artist doesn't have the same...
I don't really have a choice.
Doesn't have the same control with the audience. Right. Okay, fantastic. That was fascinating. Naomi, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. It was really interesting.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.